What's up everyone, it's me Lone, I hope you're doing alright. Today we've got a potential concern when it comes to Starfield and its PC version specifically. This is all stemming from an announcement by AMD where they stated that they will be Starfield's exclusive PC partner. Now as a result of this agreement, people are naturally concerned that we won't be receiving a highly requested NVIDIA feature in the game, whether at launch or potentially ever, and of course that feature is NVIDIA DLSS. In this video, I'll be explaining very briefly what DLSS is, how it compares to AMD's alternative of FSR, and ultimately trying to answer the question, as PC players of Starfield, should we be concerned? I've done a bunch of research for this video, the sources for which are all linked in the description below, and I do hope this video helps you all out. So if you enjoy it, please do like it, I would really appreciate it. Subscribe if you're new. We're continuing to cover all things Starfield until the launch of the game and beyond. But with all that out of the way, let's get right into it. So this all began with a video on AMD's YouTube channel, which is titled AMD is Starfield's exclusive PC partner. In that video, they state that they've worked hand in hand with BGS to optimize Starfield for both Xbox and PC with Ryzen 7000 series processors and Radeon 7000 series graphics. According to them, these optimizations accelerate performance and enhance the quality of your gameplay using highly multi-threaded code that both Xbox and PC players will get to take advantage of. And then the man himself, Todd Howard, got on camera to state that they have AMD engineers in their code base working on FSR2 image upscaling and processing. According to him, it looks incredible and you get the benefits for that on your PC and also Xbox. So before we go any further, I want to explain what FSR and DLSS actually are. So AMD's FSR and NVIDIA's DLSS are both a form of upscaling technology, where you can take a game running at a lower resolution and display it at a higher resolution like 1440p or 4K without much of a noticeable drop in image quality. When it comes to FSR, it works on all GPUs and even consoles because it's actually software based. And we're currently on FSR2, with FSR3 apparently releasing later in the year, but this is going to be after Starfield because Todd Howard specifically mentioned FSR2 in that video. When it comes to DLSS, that is a hardware-based solution and it requires certain NVIDIA RTX GPUs relying on their tensor cores. So for instance, DLSS 2 runs on RTX 2000 and 3000 line GPUs, and the new DLSS 3 is only available on RTX 4000 GPUs. So what is the concern? Because this partnership is exclusive, the very high likelihood is that Starfield will not support DLSS, whether at launch or potentially ever. And because of that, FSR will probably be the only upscaling option available for the game. Only a very small minority of the games developed under these exclusive agreements with AMD have DLSS. So games like Far Cry 6, Resident Evil 4, Dead Island 2, The Callisto Protocol, and Star Wars Jedi Survivor all do not have DLSS to this day. The only AMD-sponsored games which also support DLSS tend to be PS5 exclusive titles, such as The Last of Us Part 1, Uncharted Legacy of Thieves Collection, and Forspoken. So even though it's not officially confirmed that Starfield won't have DLSS, that very much seems to be the implication, and I don't think we should expect otherwise, especially because they use the word exclusive in the title. And generally, not only do more people prefer DLSS over FSR, and I'll explain why in a second, but players ultimately like having a choice, so they can see what upscaler works best for them. Deathloop, for instance, supported both FSR and DLSS, so you got to choose between the two. So how does FSR actually compared to DLSS? So we can't compare FSR3 to DLSS3 because of course FSR3 isn't out yet, and some people may argue it's not entirely fair to compare FSR2 to DLSS3, but I would still say that since this exclusive agreement is probably going to prevent us from getting DLSS3 on Starfield, I think it's entirely fair to ask the question whether FSR2 is going to do as good of a job as DLSS3 probably would have done. Hopefully once FSR3 comes out and there are games which support both FSR3 and also DLSS3, then we can do a proper comparison, but until then, this is the best that we have. So when it comes to answering this question, it does depend on the game, and both Hardware Unboxed and also Tech Power Up have done some fantastic comparisons. Again, those are linked in the description below. So Hardware Unboxed compared DLSS 2 specifically versus FSR 2 in 26 games across 4K and 1440p using both quality and performance modes. Now, both of those deliver roughly the same performance using the same quality modes. So in that comparison, they didn't focus on frame rate, but more the resulting image quality to determine which was the better upscaler. And what did they say? Well, in his words specifically, quote, "The overwhelming conclusion from my analysis is that DLSS is the superior upscaling technology, with near universally better results using DLSS. Out of the 104 configurations that I examined, there were only 8 times where I thought DLSS and FSR were tied, and 0 times where FSR was superior. This means that 92% of the time, I thought DLSS was, at minimum, slightly better than FSR. I was also pretty surprised to see that FSR was not able to outperform DLSS under any circumstances." And by the way, this also included AMD-sponsored titles like Uncharted and The Last of Us Part 1. He did, mind you, preface all of this by stating that at 4K quality mode specifically, the differences were less drastic, especially compared to 1440p, but still, DLSS was still the superior option across the board by varying degrees, and he could not find any examples of FSR delivering a better image quality over DLSS. Now, DLSS still has some issues. He mentions ghosting specifically, and also it having a weaker sharpening filter. But in his words, the list of issues with FSR were a lot longer. So specifically, the big issue here was image stability. There were a lot of examples where FSR had shimmering. There were issues with foliage-heavy games. Fine textures, grates, meshes, and other patterns also tripped up with FSR when it came to flickering. It struggled to produce clean images with hair and transparencies, and the quality of upscaling, as mentioned, at lower render resolutions was of a concern. So what happens when we compare DLSS 3 then? Because that was DLSS 2, so is DLSS 3 even better than FSR 2? And ultimately, it looks like it is. So this time we got to look at tech power-ups comparisons, again, linked in the description below. They've examined a bunch of games. In this video, we'll be talking about Cyberpunk and Redfall specifically, but across all of those titles, the conclusion was the same. DLSS 3 is definitely the better upscaling technology versus FSR 2. So, in the Cyberpunk comparison, they stated the following. Quote, "The FSR 2.1 implementation comes with noticeable compromises in image quality, in favor of performance in most sequences of the game. We spotted excessive shimmering and flickering on vegetation, tree leaves, and thin still objects. The anti-aliasing quality is also inferior, as the overall image quality has more jagged lines in motion, especially visible behind cars while driving through the world and in vegetation. Ghosting issues are worse in DLSS at daytime, and it's even more pronounced when there is a lack of lighting in the scene. The NVIDIA DLSS frame generation implementation is excellent in this game. The overall image quality is mostly impressive. However, we spotted excessive ghosting on shadows in motion, and it also had some issues with the in-game on-screen UI, specifically the minimap, which had a very jittery look in motion. Speaking of performance, the DLSS and FSR upscalers are practically identical in terms of performance gain. And then when we come to Redfall, quote, FSR 2.1 temporal stability completely falls apart when moving trees are in the player's view, as if motion blur effects were enabled at the highest value, which even our screenshots reveal, and it's visible even when standing still across all resolutions and quality modes. Thin still objects, wires, and power lines are also losing temporal stability at medium and far distances and create noticeable shimmering issues or disappear completely at lower resolutions. The NVIDIA DLSS frame generation implementation is excellent in this game, and the overall image quality is quite impressive. Even small particle effects, such as different varieties of the player's magic abilities, are rendered correctly, even during fast movement. So, in the midst of all of these issues with FSR compared to DLSS, why would Bethesda do this? I think it ultimately comes down to 2 things. Number one, of course, money. AMD's probably paid Bethesda a huge sum of money in order to become Starfield's exclusive PC partner. So that one's obvious. But number 2, on paper, I can see why it makes sense for Bethesda, because AMD's FSR, as I mentioned, is also available on console and DLSS isn't. And Starfield ultimately is exclusive for Xbox. So it's a partnership that kind of makes sense. However, does it also make sense to exclude DLSS on PC? Can you still get that benefit for players on console without an exclusivity agreement? I would argue that you can, and that you're still just frustrating players on PC. But I'll get to my final thoughts in a second. Ultimately though, is this the end of the world? Should we as PC players be really concerned when it comes to Starfield now and how it's going to be running? I honestly don't think so for several reasons. Number one, modders are our best friend and they will probably add in DLSS very quickly. This occurred with Resident Evil 4, the remake, and many have said that it's a much better upscaling implementation than FSR2 in terms of both performance and graphics quality. I personally don't know how true that is, but that's what people have been saying online. And since we know how proactive modders are in the Bethesda community, this is also probably going to happen very quickly. Now, this does mean you're going to have to install another mod, but we're all comfortable with that, and hopefully it does happen very quick. Plus as well, FSR3 is coming apparently by the end of the year, so we should see this supported by Starfield given the partnership, and this will hopefully further improve image quality and rectify some of those issues that I mentioned before. However, until then, it still does suck that we have to deal with the lower image quality and the issues that FSR2 produces, especially compared to DLSS 3 and even DLSS 2. Yes, it's great for those on Xbox. You will have an upscaling technology since you don't have access to DLSS, but for us on PC, there is no denying it. We would have been much better off having DLSS in addition to FSR, so we can ultimately choose which one we preferred. And performance-wise, yes, FSR and DLSS would probably be somewhat equivalent. I don't think this matters as much in terms of frame rate, though some would still argue that DLSS is slightly better when it comes to frame rate. But still, this is really about image quality, and the ultimate conclusion based on all the research is that DLSS would very likely have produced a far superior result versus FSR 2.0. So anyways, Wastanders, that's all from me. I hope you enjoyed this video and that it helped. Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. And until next time, this has been Lone. Please take care of yourselves, and would you kindly keep fighting the good fight.